Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're about to start. Thank you all for coming. Jami will join us shortly, and it's time to start. So thank you all for coming. This is one of the FIGI Security Clinics. This is the track for tracking crypto Ponzi's. So, okay, so a little about what's going to happen today. So we're going to begin with Jami's introduction into unlicensed digital investment schemes, and specifically the MLM Corporation presentation. And afterwards, I will give you an introduction to cryptocurrency to basically have a baseline of what we're going to talk about today. Then we'll break for coffee, and then we'll do a session. Well, I'll show you how to get to know your block explorers and do a case study where we track the funds of MLM. Then we'll break for lunch, and afterwards you have an interactive exercise. I hope you all brought your laptops because you're going to become the trackers, and I'm going to give you a scam, and you're going to track its money, and you're going to find out where it went.
Do we get a reward at the end?
Yeah, high five. you get a coupon for coffee at the cafeteria.
You get a coin, a token.
And then we'll break for another cup of coffee, and then Mr. Imran will present from Interpol. Will present a presentation on the law enforcement perspective on international cooperation in terms of crypto Ponzi scam and money seizures. So, Jami,
good morning.
Take the floor.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jami Solli. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jami Solli. I am a financial consumer protection lawyer, and I work as an independent consultant, and I also have a public interest advocacy organization called the Global Alliance for Legal Aid. And it's through the Global Alliance for Legal Aid that I actually encountered a large group of Ponzi victims in Uganda. So I'll talk a little bit about the impact of Ponzi schemes on persons, their families, and also the society and economy at large. I think before I start, maybe we could go around the room and introduce ourselves and explain our interest, our work, why we're interested in this topic in particular. Okay? Let's start with Marusa.
Consulting, and I am interested because I work with some fintechs and some companies who work in the forex and things like that, with Bitcoin. So I need to know who I am.
And have you had any major Brazilian Ponzi schemes that come to mind in recent years?
Yeah. We had like every year we have more and more.
Yeah.
We had like 25 cases in the 2 last years. And currently the Security Commission, they made a regulation about that. And now they put in the first page the names of suspect schemes that are being investigated.
In the newspaper?
No, in the internet.
Oh, on the internet. Okay. Okay.
So, they recommend that before you make an investment, you should visit there to see if they are
registered and licensed or on the bad list. Okay, interesting. Thank you. Sir?
Rafik Shabouni. I'm a doctor in cryptography and information security. Rafik Shabouni. I'm a doctor in cryptography and information security from EPFL. I worked for a private bank for 2.5 years, where I helped them develop some strategies on blockchains and DLTs and what they can be, what they can achieve in that field. And I left to be as an independent because I got a lot of requests for startups in this field for recommendation on how to secure their ledgers and how to track basically when there are cases of fraud.
Oh, great. So we're going to expect a lot of examples from you today. Thank you.
Welcome.
Over here, sir, please.
My name is James Kinuthia from Communications Authority of Kenya.
I can't hear. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. My name is James Kinuthia from Communications Authority of Kenya. So basically it's about the regulatory interventions on the online transactions. Yes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dominic Oak. I work with the communications regulator in Kenya. My interest is also to understand that with the crypto and Ponzi schemes moving now into the telecommunication sector, I think one of the issues that we see more is the phishing SMSs, whereby we get most people getting maybe I don't know to say whether it's too duped to participate in sending money and issues like that. So possibly the regulatory interventions, yes, and how to track such kind of schemes.
May I just quickly give a note about the microphone? So if you're not speaking, make sure that your microphone is turned off, just so we can avoid any echoes.
Oh, sorry. Good morning, everyone. Oh, sorry. I'm called Masuga Vincent from Uganda. I work with Uganda Communications Commission, which is a regulator for the telecoms. The main interest is I want to look at the regulatory part of it. How do we come in to intervene? And then also on the investigation part, because I happen to work with the Computer Emergency Response Team, which is responsible for the security incidents and the investigations. Because as of now, I think you must have heard in our country, we have already arrested some few people who have been defrauding our citizens when it comes to the crypto and through such kind of platforms. So our concern is how do we come in to do some kind of investigation to help especially the security agencies, because they have a lot of trust in us and they always come to us to help them on the investigation part of it. Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to say there is a huge echo in the audio. Thank you. You think that's only for this earpiece?
It's everyone.
Okay,
If you want, you can just talk loudly.
there must be more than one microphone picking up the audio in that room, because it was for all of you. Excuse me?
Someone is going to come and fix it from
I think you should ask a technician to try to fix that. Someone who is familiar with the audio stuff here.
So just talk loudly for now, so we're
Yeah.
not all annoyed by the
I would request if this issue is fixed first and then we proceed, because it's really disturbing. I would request the issue. Okay.
turn your microphone off and then we can just speak loudly for now.
Thank you.
So if that's all right, until the tech person gets here, just so we don't delay. Can you all hear me okay, or should I talk louder?
All right.
I can be super loud.
It's fine. Thank you.
So, you are our last person. Can you please just introduce yourself, Dr. Wilke?
Oh, yes.
Explain to the people what you do and what your interest is in the topic.
Okay, thank you. My name is Wolfgang Balzer. I was actually working in the focus group Digital Financial Services, which then became FIGI, in the work stream Quality of Service. We have kind of completed our work by submitting the to thank you. It has some relation to pattern recognition, to technical elements which are more in the focus of my work. So I apologize for leaving quite early for this SG12 meeting, but so far I just want to say what you are doing here is really, I think, very valuable and very interesting just the same. So thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. I think because we are such a small group, it's wonderful if you have a thought and you want to share it in that moment. I'm very happy to have a dialogue versus me blah, 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 blah all morning. Okay? So what I have to do today we as a working group did some in-depth research on this topic in Kenya, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and India. And that is the subject of a report that the working group put out, mainly looking at the tools at the regulator's disposition, the legal and the regulatory frameworks, but how there was a whole-scale lack of collaboration between the entities that should be policing and regulating the markets. And as an end result, there were so many of these frauds, which are now flourishing thanks to the internet. So today we'll talk about what are these schemes, what was our specific focus, the consequences, why they're thriving, who's still investing in these things anyway, when to some of us they're quite obviously frauds. We'll look at some of the human behavioral aspects. What can be done to monitor the social networks? These are schemes that have to be very present on the social networks in order to attract victims. So what can we do to identify these and to shut them down before they cause mass losses? And do we have good examples from countries who have been better identifying and shutting down these things versus focusing on the prosecutions, which really are not helping consumers because the money is already gone by the time the prosecutions start. So essentially you're wasting state resources to do the prosecutions instead of shifting those resources to the prevention mechanisms. How can we change the narrative about unlicensed digital investment schemes, or how can we actually have a narrative that informs and advises the public? Because there seems to be none in many countries, or rather they are happening after a scheme has already collapsed, which is too late to advise consumers. And then lastly, we'll look at one global digital Ponzi scheme, the MLM scheme, which originated in the late 90s in Russia and then migrated both to the internet but also to about 80 plus countries around the world. So we'll look at that scheme a bit more in depth and where it is now. And then we'll switch to Assaf, who will be showing us how to track the flows of funds from these schemes. Okay, so that's my morning agenda for you all. And I repeat, if you have a thought or you have an idea or you have a case study you want to share, please leap in. Just kind of raise your hand if our mics aren't working. Okay? Now we can go back to the mic. Test. Oh, the echo's gone. Okay. Thank Thank you very much.
You can use the keyboard.
Oh, I can use my own. So what is a UDIS? We actually got the title Unlicensed Digital Investment Schemes from some IMF articles that came out. The IMF was one of the initial global institutions that we found that were looking at this issue, but they were tracking the Ponzi schemes that were more face-to-face and selling on telephones versus digital Ponzi schemes. So our working group defined UDIS as digitally enabled financial frauds, whereby the consumers are promised very unnaturally high returns. However, mostly unbeknownst to the targeted victims, there was not an underlying productive asset or a company from which these profits were being generated. The profits were being generated from new victims who came later to pay the original victims. So I say usually unbeknownst to the targeted consumer, because sometimes, of course, there are people who are very familiar with Ponzi schemes and are actually hoping to get in on an initial investment and get out before the Ponzi scheme collapses. So there is a small percentage of people that we think are clearly aware that these are Ponzi schemes. But it is my personal belief that the mass of investors or victims are not at all aware. What are the consequences of UDIS? Well, first we see at the individual level, there are severe mental and physical health consequences for individuals as well as their families. The victims themselves experience illnesses, hypertension, heart attacks, diabetes, all of which are related to the extreme stress that the financial losses caused them. We've also seen victims and spouses who divorce, friends and family members, and people's social networks break up, because of course there's always people who are influencing their family members to invest, and then they feel extreme guilt and relationships sour because of that. And in some very dire cases, mental health deteriorates such that the victims have actually killed themselves. I'm glad we have some representatives from East African countries here, because East Africa has some very fairly recent Ponzi schemes that were not digital schemes, but with which I'm familiar. For example, there were the Kawe schemes in Uganda, as well as Dutch International scheme. I was actively involved in trying to help those victims get redress. We were unable to, but I interviewed 65 of the victims out of perhaps more than 3,000 victims. We had some very, very sad stories to share with the world. Just when I thought one victim's story was the saddest I'd ever heard, then came somebody else who was worse. And perhaps the worst story I heard was from a grandmother who was responsible for her four grandchildren, for raising them. And when she lost money in the scheme, she had to send 2 children away to beg on the streets and perhaps prostitute themselves, and another 2 other relatives. And she was so depressed about this that she went to the chemist, to the pharmacist, to try to buy some drugs with which to kill herself. But she didn't have appropriate funds. She didn't have sufficient funds to buy the medicine that she wanted to kill herself. So we actually find horrific, horrific stories, and people do not recover from this. This is something that impacts future generations, as well as the generation that lost the funds. A related problem is that people are borrowing to invest in these schemes. So they are going to legitimate financial institutions and taking out loans and dumping that money, so to speak, in these schemes. So the end result is financial exclusion, which is why we are very interested in the topic. At the national level, we see that countless sums that people are dumping into these schemes are then not available for investments in productive assets, for new homes, for educations. And on the side of the state, we see that there's a vast amount of resources that are perhaps wasted in going after these criminals and trying to prosecute them when the money is long gone. In our working group, we had the benefit of somebody from the Bank of Bangladesh, who's from the Financial Intelligence Unit, who actually had to go testify in a court case against a Ponzi scheme, and he wasted how much of his time, his staff time, preparing for giving his testimony and actually going to court. And he told me, quite honestly, the assets are long gone. So what we can hope to get is not going to be distributed to the people who lost money. So there you see a prime example of state resources just being wasted because of the Ponzi schemes. Why do consumers still fall for these schemes? This is a big human behavioral question. And I mean, there has not been a lot of research done about this, but when you look at this particular character, this is Sergey Mavrodi. He's the founder of the MLM scheme that we're going to talk about a little bit more in the future. Would you invest your money with this guy? I mean, look at him. Then after you're done looking at him, look at the guys in the background who are clearly his bodyguards with their shirts kind of unbuttoned. He doesn't look like the most charismatic human being, but at the time he was very charismatic, and he put out TV ads, and he had a whole mini series starring this character who was kind of a not very popular, kind of a loser. He didn't have a lot of money, and this TV miniseries showed this gentleman who invested in the scheme and made money, and suddenly he had money to buy a fur coat for his wife. He had money for a car. So this is kind of the mentality that the scammers play upon. It also suggests too that people are desperate. The core population that we are studying that are victims of these schemes in developing countries, they're not necessarily eating every day, nor regularly. They come from countries that have very high unemployment rates. I've seen statistics, for example, from Nigeria, from the youth population that shows, these are official stats, that 55% are unemployed. So this is the pool upon which criminals prey, people who are very desperate. And that is also combined with low financial literacy. Now, having low financial literacy or high financial literacy is not necessarily going to save you from being a victim. I just saw research that indicated that it was research done in Indonesia on a pool of Ponzi scheme victims, and they showed that people who had the higher levels of financial literacy amongst this victim group were more likely to have put in more money in the scheme. So it shows that there's something more at play here, and that humans are very irrational actors. So we have to really do a lot more in-depth study into the issue of why, and that has not historically been done. So back to financial literacy levels, it doesn't help that people have low financial literacy levels. They're generally low, and generally the lowest amongst populations which are considered prime targets for these Ponzi. So your youth populations, youth by virtue of their youth don't have the worldly experience with financial investing. They are a prime target, as well as your elderly populations who are particularly vulnerable. Just in general, the OECD every year does their literacy analysis, their assessment. And in 2015, they started to assess countries on financial literacy. They showed that amongst the OECD countries, 22% of youth on average test at level 1 on a scale of 1 to 5 or lower in terms of being financially literate. So only 22% are very not financially literate. The results also show that at best, this group of youth can tell the difference between needs and wants, and they can make spending decisions, daily spending decisions. This is a really low standard. They know the difference between a need and a want, and they can make a decision about spending. I mean, that's really, really a low bar. Okay. So more on the human psyche. What do we really know? It's not a lot, in essence. And there's not, in a lot of countries, there's not a counter narrative being put forward by regulators. There's not a government message other than a central bank sometimes putting out a message after the fact saying, buyer beware. These are schemes that you shouldn't invest in, but that's really too late. And to be honest, who amongst you is looking at the central bank's website on a regular basis? Anyone besides Marusa, who used to work there? No. So counter narratives, also the source of the messaging, I think is very important. If the message is coming from government, what I've heard in some countries from victims is, oh, they don't want us to make any money. They don't have our best interests at heart. So we feel that the counter narratives need to come from somebody that the public trusts, similar to how fraudsters are operating. So you see in a lot of countries that sometimes the fraudsters will involve preachers, rugby stars, personalities that are very famous and that people look up to. Assaf and I were discussing yesterday how the Kardashians in the United States influence a lot of the younger generation's thoughts, and Kanye West. We make fun of this, but in reality, those are the types of people that need to be putting out messages on social networks saying that these types of scams are out there and beware. Effective messaging can also come from those who've lost funds. Kenya had a big Ponzi scheme that was not a digital Ponzi scheme, but operating around the 2006-2007 era, whereby 26,000 victims self-organized and collectively have been advocating for their redress rights. The problem is with asking victims groups to organize and advocate and put out messages is that, one, they don't have any funding. They've already lost money. But two, there's a lot of shame associated with being a Ponzi scheme victim. It's not something that you want to go out and tell your friends and family that, hey, I lost money, I was stupid. There's a lot of finger pointing by people saying, you were greedy, you should have known better, that was stupid of you. Who's the typical victim of these schemes? Well, with the advent of the internet, we are seeing a slight shift in that the profile of Bernie Madoff's victims or some of the Ponzi schemers that used to have to sell face-to-face, they went after their own social networks, their affinity groups, their religious and club members. They might have preyed more on the elderly, the retired. But now we're seeing that these schemes are promoted on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, even in closed WhatsApp groups. And our prediction is that we're going to see a spike in younger victims. Research from CGAP, I would suggest, supports this. CGAP put out a report about digital borrowers in East Africa who are predominantly male. And they can tell from the data that these males are taking out loans, they're taking out credit products on Friday nights or Saturday nights and using the money to have fun in clubs or to gamble. So there is not much difference between using a loan to gamble and using that money to invest, what they think is investing in a Ponzi scheme. Research that is ongoing now in Indonesia that some university students are doing has shown that 75% of digital borrowers are considered youth. They're between the ages of 18 and 35. So we're seeing that because of the internet, this pool of victims has essentially enlarged. I'm going to stop right here for a moment and see if anybody has any thoughts or comments to add coming from your country level experiences or questions.
We have almost every day in the news, in the TV, a notice about someone that lost all or some scheme that was discovered.
Yeah.
Like that. And it doesn't work a lot because the people, they want to get the easy money.
They want to believe. They're desperate. There's something about...
Yeah, because it's something that we keep saying, how can... Yesterday, someone was here to talk about that, and next week there are many other people that are doing the same thing. It's something very weird. Because they believe that they won't be the victim.
It's somewhat the gold rush mentality that we had in California in the 1800s. That everybody just is so desperate to believe that they can strike it rich, that they will put aside all reason. So we can't trust that we can educate consumers out of this issue, I think. So what do we do to prevent it? Well, a big factor, I think, is social network responsibility. Do they allow people to sell arms on Facebook? To sell humans? To sell drugs? These are things that regulators quite quickly swarm in on and would shut down a site if they saw that this was going on. But how long does the social network take to shut down some of these advertisements for high yield investment funds that are not registered? Well, it's telling, I think, when we look at the social network's terms and conditions of use, because they actually ban these types of ads. This is the Facebook policy and therefore Instagram and WhatsApp policy, the terms and conditions that I just took from online. And it says under their fraud and deception policy rationale, in an effort to prevent and disrupt harmful or fraudulent activity, we remove content aimed at deliberately deceiving people to gain an unfair advantage or deprive another of money, property, or a legal right. We do this. That's what they're telling us. We proactively do this. So do not post, you user, do not post confidence schemes, romance, military impersonation scams, Ponzi schemes or pyramid schemes, setting up false businesses, or investment schemes with a promise of high return. Do not do that. But are these enforced? If you go on Facebook right now, plug in high yield investment, whatever country, you're going to find reams and reams of these scams. But I guess from an enforcement perspective, the good news is that these schemes have to advertise. So that means we can use keyword, natural language searches to locate these schemes. We can identify them and cross-reference them with registered licensed investment advisors and investment companies. But I don't see that happening. I've found one example from Korea of a crypto Ponzi scheme whereby the Korean police came out and said, we are using AI to track these schemes. Years ago, before this was possible in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission used to have what they called a surf day, where they would get all the regulators together and sit, and they would all surf the web manually, looking for these schemes, make their list, and then cross-reference them manually. That would take how many hours if they kept doing this regularly, we don't know, but they would allocate at least one day a year to doing this. Now we don't need to do it that way. We can use AI, but again, I can't come across any more examples than the Korean police that have. So Marusa mentioned that people are looking at social networks and posting a negative list. Do you have any examples from your countries? It's kind of why I put this blue sky up here. There's room for starting and experimenting. There's a couple other examples I can come up with of regulators doing some techniques to try to prevent these schemes. Another one came from the US, from the Federal Trade Commission, and what they would do is they would put up a bait site. And the bait site had all the indicators of being a Ponzi scheme. It was something that was promoting a high yield investment to the public. And when they convinced somebody to plug in their details and invest in this scheme, the screen suddenly went red and said, you've lost all your money, or you almost lost all of your money. And it would redirect the user to an educational page that would tell them how to recognize Ponzi schemes. So that was up for a while. I don't know how long, and I don't know how many users it impacted. Another example of some preventative techniques I read about, but I can't confirm that it actually took place, came from Nigeria. And the Nigerian Central Bank wanted to set up a soap opera, whereby the storyline was about somebody who invested in one of these schemes and lost money, which I think is a good idea, but I don't know if they actually ever came up with the funds to create this soap opera or how long it lasted. So those are the only global examples that I am aware of. And I think that means that there's either a lack of will on the part of the regulators, or a lack of budget, or a combination of other factors. So today's featured Ponzi scheme is the MLM cooperation. So this is a scheme that originated in Russia. It was originally called just MMM, Mavrodi Mondial Movement or Money Box, and subsequently, as it's crashed and reformed, it's changed its name. So I have a little cartoon up there indicating that it's not a Ponzi scheme, it's a Ponzi fund. What MMM says is it's a global movement, it's a global social movement to help people. When you can, you put in money, and when you need it, you take it out. The problem is, when you need it, it's not there. The history of MMM originally started also offering 1,000% return on investment to people. And 10 million Russians at the beginning started to invest in it. Perhaps the problem and the climate at the time was that the Russian, the Soviet Union had broken up and there had not been the ability to invest in the capital markets. So people didn't really know what a real investment should look like, yet they were operating in this kind of gold fever type atmosphere whereby they saw people getting rich. And so it really, it created this mental mindset, I think. Estimated losses in the first collapse were anywhere from 100 million US dollars to 1 billion US dollars. And as I mentioned earlier, this was something that the MMM found or utilized TV advertisements and a series to really get people to see how they could become rich. He showed this guy who invested and suddenly had all this disposable cash and had a beautiful wife, and it really worked on people's minds. Sergey, the founder of MMM, after he did a spell in prison for tax evasion, came out and he was still so popular, he was actually elected to the Russian parliament. In about 2011, the scheme reemerged and it digitalized. So it was accepting online accounts or online transfers of money from people. And then at some point in time, it also started accepting Bitcoin, which became preferred as the means of transferring money. And MMM at its peak, we saw, was exported to 80 plus countries, and it really had its roots in African countries. It really did a lot of damage and was scamming quite a few consumers there. The more modern history of MMM is still active. If you put MMM cooperation in any Facebook or social network site, even Googling it, you'll come up with Instagram pages, even YouTube videos from people promoting it. We looked at it in depth because we had some information. I can't talk too much about our report because it was already published. But if you look at the report, it's published on the ITU website. We had some data because the central bank or the settlements bank was actually participating in our working group. So when people in Nigeria were transferring money to MMM, they flagged the reason code as to why they were transferring money. So the interbank settlements, we saw that it was visible that in a 6-month period, 70 million US dollars was transacted. Now, at the same time we looked at this site, we also noticed, we started counting on social networks how many other schemes we came across, and we identified at least 90 other schemes. So just to give you the level of damage, the volume, in one scheme in 6 months, 70 million US dollars was transacted. That was more in Nigeria than the state's educational budget. And of course, that money was all lost. But flash forward, 2016, that collapsed. And again, now we see that this year the scheme was reborn and just changed its name, and people are starting to invest in it all over again. So please.
If during your research, there was also consideration of this multi-level marketing and how they relate to maybe Ponzi schemes. I don't know if you came across anything like that.
Yeah, we didn't really look at multi-level marketing, but I think it's a very, very similar situation. And in some countries, even multi-level marketing has a better reputation, so to speak, such that people in desperate situations, I work a lot in Indonesia, so I'll give you an example from Indonesia. College students need money, and they don't necessarily have it or get a sufficient quantity from their family. So the MLMs come on campus and have a field day with promoting and getting college students to purchase their products and then resell it. Students that we interviewed, I would say 90% of them have no idea that the vast majority of these MLMs are frauds. They see this as a valid means of, even when they personally lose money and they're not making any income over time, they've actively participated, they still don't recognize that that was a fraud. So I think these are operating similarly, except the distinction that we are looking at is the Ponzi schemes in particular. They're not purporting to sell a product, for example. So MLMs are purporting to have some sort of product that they're selling, but they're really only making money by getting new people to come in and buy this product. And there's a dispute. Some people will dispute you to the death about whether or not Herbalife is a Ponzi scheme or whether or not, what's the other one? Amway, yeah, is a Ponzi scheme. But if you really dissect and look at where the income flows are coming from, where the profit's coming from, I think you'll see that it's, it is similar to a pyramid scheme. But we didn't look specifically at that. Some interesting research that you just brought to my mind that I read the other day is, I can't remember the title specifically. It's called The Madoffization of Society. And it was written by 2 Irish researchers. And they're talking about how all of these schemes are actually an effect of the deregulation and this idea in society that we can get rich through debt products. So as we saw with the 2007 collapse in the economy, that was essentially caused by a debt crisis. And that is creating this atmosphere globally, which leads more people to be investing in these types of schemes. And that article really struck me because I hadn't thought about it from that perspective before, that it's a convergence of a lot of factors in society. So other studies that we've come across, there are not really a lot out there as I would expect, but they're starting to pick up because the computer science people are more interested in this topic. Academics from Berkeley, Qatar, Luxembourg, and Sri Lanka analyzed the MLM scheme too. They looked at it over a period of 3 years, and this was particularly interesting because they looked at the metrics for how a crypto Ponzi is operating, and they shared their data whereby they were able to link Bitcoin addresses directly to the Ponzi scheme. So I've got the link in my presentation. It's a particularly interesting article also because it just came out last month. And they viewed 2.5 million user profiles on this chat called Bitcoin Talk, a discussion forum, and they were searching for all the Bitcoin addresses associated with MLM membership. And they came up with over 15,000 addresses. Essentially, then they looked at almost 500,000 transactions to analyze whether or not that was related to the MLM scheme. So this shows you the volume of data. If you're going to be doing this analysis, you really need to be doing it using with computer scientists sitting next to you, because you can't have the regulator just doing this using their own eyeballs. That's never going to work. So in this particular research, additional findings were that 41 of the participants in this MLM scheme related to Bitcoin did not get any returns whatsoever. They were able to classify the victims. So there were 41% that never got any returns. So that means they're pure victims. There was a sample that did get some returns, but had majority of losses. And then they were also able to see the addresses, the Bitcoin addresses of people who were pure scammers, who were only receiving transfers and didn't put any money in. And they saw the highest earning scammer got $750,000 US. And at its peak, they also saw that MLM was transacting 150 million US dollars a day. So now we start to see some of the volumes thanks to this data analysis. And I think that will help convince regulators that they should start paying attention to these frauds. They also tracked that there were pairs of transfer countries. So there were 80 countries that they were able to see involved, and they were able to track the flows between pairs of countries. And they determined that in Indonesia as a country as a whole received 12 times transfers coming in than flows out. Another really interesting study that I've come across comes out of the University of Cagliari in Sardinia in Italy. And they were focusing really primarily on Ethereum platform. And they were able to detect Ponzi's on Ethereum because they looked at the bytecode and essentially, check if I'm explaining this correctly, but essentially they took an example of a Ponzi scheme that had collapsed, a known Ponzi scheme, and they compared the bytecode of that to others that they suspected might be Ponzi schemes. And when the difference in the character strings in the code was a small amount, under 0.35%, they considered that it was most likely a Ponzi scheme. So using that analysis, they were able to find slews of Ponzi schemes and illustrating that this is another tool, at least on Ethereum, to identify potential Ponzi schemes. So back to our MLM cooperation, as it's been renamed and resurrected like the Phoenix. Now, media reports this year that there are perhaps 7 million new members. And as of July, it was seen to be in pre-collapse mode. I think it could actually essentially have been collapsed, but there still seem to be scammers present on the social networks who are happy to take your money if you want to invest in it. So the message from this that I want to share is that we started talking about this and sharing our results with the regulator at least 2.5 years ago. What has been done in the interim is basically nothing. This is still an active scheme that keeps reinventing itself. So that's where I conclude, and I want to see if you have input, comments, questions, theories on human behavior.
What I think is impressive is that the people, when you shut down a scheme, they just open another one, the same person, and with another name or another figure, and the people still invest.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that Sergey, the founder of MMM, is dead, and the scheme lives on. So obviously there's a collaborative group working and using his same methodology. He also at one point had a program online about how to become an MMM seller. So essentially a school about how to become a Ponzi fraudster.
Was investing in future generations.
Yeah, in education. Thoughtful of him.
Can I ask? Oh, sorry.
Just a thought also. I don't know if part of the behavior you realize that, like in Kenya, most of these Ponzi schemes happen towards the elections or during the electioneering period.
That's what I heard, and I would urge you to read this article that I just mentioned, The Madoffization of Society, because it talks about a kind of a collusion of things and happening in society at the same time. So with elections, I was just in Kenya and there were some local regional elections going on and people were in Kibera handing out money and gifts and things like that. And I thought, if I hang out long enough, maybe I'll get some money. But it's just that cash is there. There is no recognition that this is a potential scam. It's really a series of factors and a combination of them. And there hasn't been research to determine what is the tipping point. But in Kenya and Uganda, another interesting factor that I saw was this period of extreme microfinance institution growth, such that NGOs were doing microfinance. They were kind of left alone by the regulator because the regulator thought these are potentially a force for good, for poverty alleviation. So consumers at that point in time were not even able to distinguish a scam from a real microfinance institution. And that was essentially the case with the COE scam. People came into the offices. This was an institution that mimicked microfinance, and it put up a license on the wall saying, we're licensed by the cooperative authority. Here it is. You can trust us. And they handed out blankets to people. They organized people in investment or savings groups. They mimicked what the real microfinance institutions were doing. And the regulator was not present. The regulator was given this strong message by a variety of organizations, including the World Bank, saying, let's not rush to regulate. Let's let this new activity grow and let's study it. Let's not intervene and block it. And essentially, isn't this the message we're hearing now with fintech and with digital financial services? Let's have a regulatory sandbox. Let's invite them all in. Let's study them. Let's not rush to hinder growth here because this might be a good thing. But in that same shadow, that's under that same umbrella, the fraudsters creep in and they take advantage of it. And essentially, I don't see that historically we're learning. Fraudsters are learning and adapting, but regulators are not. And I don't want to pick on any country because this is a global problem. This is something that is impacting every country. It's just to a matter of degrees. It is impacting some countries worse than others. For example, if we have data from the IMF looking at the Latin American countries where some of these schemes rose to the level of taking 25% of the GDP. That's huge. In Albania, we have a colleague from ITU from Albania. He remembers quite clearly when it caused a civil situation whereby the government was basically pushed out. 2,000 people were killed because of Ponzi schemes in Albania. So these are things that could very well cause systemic risk and collapse. Madoffization of Society. And it was 2 Irish researchers. Oh, thank you. In a bad way, though.
So
our telcos so that they can try to advise their clients on how to block certain kind of actions in terms of the cyber intelligence. So is there a way we can keep track in the background of such kind of things?
Mm-hmm.
Either using maybe artificial intelligence or something that we can bring on board and say, okay, these are the schemes that are happening, however, so we need to take action. We are coming work with either the central bank, maybe we work with the financial intelligence authorities. So that's my thinking as we try to wait for the interventions.
Yeah, I think there's several things that can be done that are not being done. One that I would, as a regulator, do is put some pressure on the social networks and definitely on Facebook. You have your terms and conditions out there that say that this is not allowable on your site. Why are you allowing it? So regulators have the authority to question Facebook. They don't. Even in my country, in the US, I don't see strong pressure on them. The other thing that you can do is basically what the police in Korea were doing, is use artificial intelligence to be scrolling the web and looking for examples of these advertisements, and then cross-referencing the advertisements with your licensing body. Who's licensing your investment advisors? Do you have like an SEC, a Securities and Exchange type commission that's licensing these companies and advisors? And if you're finding ads and that entity is not registered and licensed, there should be a call made to them. What are you doing? What are you all about? So those are two things that can be done. Assaf is actually going to show us how to do some other things, and we'll have the gentleman from Interpol here later who will tell us what Interpol is doing with this. They do put out country level notices, but those country level notices are warnings, and they are generally coming after another country has had a bad experience. So the country will report, let's say Ghana will report that it's had a lot of these Ponzi schemes, and it will put out this notice so that all of the member states get it and can be apprised of that one or two or three particular schemes. That's important. This collaboration is very important because a scheme will shut down in Nigeria and day two it will open in Ghana. You know, they're really limited only by their ability to communicate effectively with people. So if the language skills are there and the cultural knowledge is there, boom, they're going to hit every country they can that speaks that language. MMM operators, I've been on chats with them. They'll chat with me in English, they'll chat with me in French, they'll actually chat in Russian. So, you know, it's organized crime.
Can I ask something?
Please.
So I didn't know about MMMs before this presentation. I just knew of MLMs.
Yeah.
And which is probably more in popular culture, at least in the US and Canada where I'm from. So I found with MLMs what maybe has been helpful is the shift in popular culture in different documentaries or podcasts or this and that bring out kind of MLMs for what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And slowly there's a shift, but maybe MMMs is still too technical or something, like it hasn't reached popular culture in the same way that MLMs has. So
definitely.
I wonder if that's a factor. Again, I just come from a very North American perspective. I don't know how it is across the world, but also with MLMs in the US, there's some, or maybe seems to be some ties with the government, and that are like, you know, the DeVos family who started Amway or something, who are very, very well connected.
Yep.
And that's how they're able to perpetuate their power, is because they can stop.
They can stop investigations. Yeah.
So like we talk about governments doing all this stuff, but then how do you counteract like the charisma of these people to woo governments and things like that, to soften.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I think that's what I'm trying to talk about when I discuss having a narrative or having a counter narrative. It's using some of these same charismatic figures that are used. We see from some of the schemes that they use sports figures or famous actors, actresses who might not even be aware of what they're advertising. It's just that they got paid and they're happy, so they go away. We need to start using some of those figures. And the fact of the matter is that government is not putting out any narrative other than to say, don't invest. And that happens after there's been a collapse of one of these schemes. But to deal with the political subterfuge and corruption, India, for example, has a lot of instances where investigations have been blocked because powerful politicians or powerful people are making money from these schemes. That is one of the biggest problems, and I don't really know how to address that other than to have prosecutions. But you're right, the MLM marketing schemes, there have been documentaries. They've been studied for longer. With the Ponzi's, we're only aware in the popular media of people who get to be as big as Bernie Madoff and their stories and movies, and he's kind of lionized as what a brilliant guy he was. And Charles Ponzi, the original Italian from many years ago. But yeah, not a lot of public awareness raising happening. That takes a budget. So also, if you even have a consumer protection organization working on this, they have no budgets. Those are like one-man bands in most countries. Anyone else? You're all on your phones looking for Ponzi's, I can tell. Please.
My question is, what is the future of cryptocurrencies and the Ponzi scheme? Because my view is I would rather live in the Stone Age, but I'm worried about my children who will, of course, embrace the cryptos and the future technology. So what? Because like for example, you go into a country and they tell you, we can't start regulating until we see the technology, has manifested. But within that period, when you allow that, is the period within which they will make all their money and leave.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the future of cryptocurrencies, given
you already have laws on investments in every country in the world. They need to be registering with a particular regulatory body, and they need to be licensed. Why are we letting all these others not do that? I mean, there's already the framework that's already there. I think the problem now is automating these processes, which a lot of countries have not kept the pace. We heard a lot about that yesterday, that there's a lot of advances in technology that regulators aren't necessarily equipped to follow, and their reaction has been to create these sandboxes, thinking that that's the way they'll catch up. It's not. You're still going to be learning just a portion of what the industry wants you to learn. And they're not going to tell you their dirty secrets.
The thing is about cryptocurrency is that currently it's unregulated because it doesn't have a jurisdiction. And because it's unregulated, because it's new technology, and because regulators are not looking and monitoring the transactions of cryptocurrencies in their own country, this is why the fraudsters are using this medium. Because if they started using credit cards, or if they started using cash and they have to do deposits or wire transfers, then taking the money out of the country is going to be very, very difficult, because you have to do SWIFT, and you have to present identifications, and you have to open bank accounts. But if you're just wiring Bitcoin, then you can easily move the money across borders and materialize it into US dollars or fiat currency in some other country without any problem. And there's no source of fund checks. So it's perfect for illegal activity. And as long as cryptocurrency and the regulators still don't have the tools and they don't have the means to monitor and regulate the traffic of crypto in their own country, cryptocurrency is gonna grow and flourish as the tool for fraud.
But they do control their fiat currency, so if you are going to cash out, they can control the exchanges.
Yeah, but the thing is that you can cash out in different countries. And if you can collect money in a certain country and cash out in another country, then if the country that you cash out in doesn't regulate the source of funds, where do you get the Bitcoin? Where did you get the Ethereum from? Mm-hmm. And today, using trackers and tools, you can do that. Each regulator can, when they regulate the exfiltration of fiat from the crypto, they can see where the money came from. And if it came from fraud, then don't let them do that. Block it. I think that's the way those fraudsters can be expelled.
Are central bankers talking about regulating the exchanges? Are there conversations happening?
We had like a new act that make you need to declare that you have and how much do you have, and when you exchange it, wherever it is, you need to declare that. And if you made profit, you need to declare.
So it's for tax purposes, like the IRS does.
Tax moves is
Yeah,
tax
but that
authorities move fast.
that might be.
Bitcoin or the cryptocurrency as it was an accident.
That, yeah. Self-interest. Beholden to the. I think so too. And then the IRS requires you to declare if you have Bitcoin and gains.
Yeah, but they don't check the source of funds.
That needs to be installed into the
Exactly.
level.
Yeah, but you know, in Brazil, they need to declare the source of funds, and this is a big problem now because some people who are lots of cryptocurrency, they cannot take their money because they did not declare the source of funds.
Yeah, but
so we have a problem now with that.
Yeah, if the regulator doesn't have the tools to verify the authenticity and correctness of the declaration, then you can say anything you want.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, but that was the reason
Selling music
that the
online.
Brazilian central bank started the same bonds because they need to have a close cooperation with the technology sector, so they can see what's happening and they can understand. They can move.
I just feel like that's going to take way too long, and the industry is not going to share their dirty secrets. I feel like we need to move back to the period in time when we started hiring the criminals to help the law enforcement, which is what the FBI has done in the United States. Quite often hires hackers to come and help them.
Okay, so
we have now a case about that. Someone which was a hacker that he was released from the prison, so he can cooperate with the authorities to tell how was the practice. But it's not so.
You don't have to go that far.
Yeah.
We're going to break for a coffee break, but afterwards I'm going to show you how you can use simple, free online tools on the internet to track crypto, see where the money came from, see where the money is going, and see where in which country it is exfiltrated into fiat. And laundered. And then law enforcement can act on that information, because in the point where the money is exfiltrated to fiat, there is KYC data. There's passport. There is a picture, ID, driver's license. And that connects the money to a person. So we're going to have a
Do you want to
break?
take, our friend from Uganda had a question before he's had his hand up for a while.
I think he has partly answered it because what I was thinking is because from what I've heard already, we were the expert in what is needed is either capacity building or transform knowledge transfer. So I would think, if possible, it may be even now there's so much willing to welcome you if you're in position to come and do some capacity building or transfer, knowledge transfer. So I think because we may not be in position to track, we may not be in position to follow up, but what is important is, do we know how it happens and how we going to follow it up? So I think the only issue is the knowledge gap. So I don't know whether you have a program on capacity building, and if you have it, then I think we shall be much willing to participate and maybe, if possible, to visit different countries. Then we shall be much willing.
This is what we're currently discussing, doing with the ITU and Interpol and other organizations that are interested to form a global entity of some sort that does work on information sharing, capacity building, and attacking this as a global problem.
Yeah, because we have in Uganda we have already arrested some few suspects, but we are working with the Interpol, we are working with Bank of Uganda, we are working with financial intelligence, but now just because for us we are the regulator and we regulate all the communication services. So we are always in front. They always first come to us to find out whether we are able to investigate such. So it's always weird to tell them no, we are not in a position, because we have the CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team, that is supposed to respond, or is supposed to investigate such kind of incidents. So we feel that maybe there is that skill gap that needs to be addressed as soon as possible.
Yeah, that was one of the recommendations in our paper too, is that in most countries there are many actors who have some sliver of responsibility, but nobody taking the lead. And so you need to even, say even if we have a group of 5 regulators and police and investigators and intelligence units working on this, one body will take the lead, because otherwise you're a headless unit. Everybody's spinning around.
And also, don't want to take away your break. In the next session, you will get some knowledge and some tools on how to do that, and hopefully you will be the ambassadors in your own countries that proliferate this message and saying there are tools available, there is knowledge available. You just need to be open and want to receive it. Okay, we'll meet back here at 11.